And we are glad that you're all here today. We know there are so many things you could be doing, especially it's the first really nice day we've had in months. Yesterday, I think it forgot it was May. It was cold out there. But I've been thinking about this theme of celebration for a long time now, several months of planning this and planning sermons to lead up to today that would make it meaningful and beneficial and get as many people here as possible. And I was thinking, even we thought about Cinco de Mayo, kind of having like a Mexican party. And we talked about having tacos instead of fish. And I decided that was a bad idea. I talked about getting the mariachi band in here. Not to lead worship, but while you're all out there eating in the gym, to stay up in the balcony and just kind of do their little thing. I thought that would have been cool to have. But on Cinco de Mayo, a mariachi band wants like $5,000 an hour. And it wasn't worth it, just to have a little bit of fun. But I was thinking about like that, like Cinco de Mayo, it is a celebration of one victory in a war. They won one battle, but they lost the war. And yet they celebrate that. Like, seems kind of odd. In fact, in Mexico, they don't even celebrate it near as much as we do in America. It's been kind of Americanized, and we celebrate Cinco de Mayo more than Mexico does. But so I was thinking about celebrations. And I love celebrations. Like, if you can tell, like, I'm pretty high-strung anyway. Like, so I love to celebrate things. And I was thinking about, like, the St. Louis Cardinals. Any St. Louis Cardinals fans in here? Okay, I'm not going to ridicule you. Any Cubs fans in here? Okay. You can switch sides if you want, and, like, separate yourself. Segregation, if you want. That'll be okay. But like when the Cardinals, they win a World Series, like they're doing champagne bottles and you see it flowing all over everybody because that's part of the celebration. When the Cubs do it, it's even bigger than that because it only happens once every 100 years. But we celebrate things like that we have a heart for, right? Like we celebrate because we have a heart for it. We celebrate things like our kids. Like we celebrate them. This is kind of weird to me. But I did it, so I'm not knocking anybody. Like they go to the potty for the first time. And we celebrate that. We're like, yay, yeah, they did it. We put it on Facebook and like, I thought about doing that with my 21-year-old, but I think she'd be mad. But we celebrate sometimes weird things, strange things, but we celebrate things that we have a heart for, that we're passionate about. I watched Tiger Woods a couple of weeks ago win the Masters tournament again. I'm a huge golf fan, a big Tiger Woods fan. He is a creep of a human being, but he can play golf like nobody else ever could. Like he's the same age as I am, so I watch this guy making billions of dollars playing golf. Well, I've got to work every day like that, but he wanted, and just the celebration, I don't know if you saw it, the celebration, just screaming, tears flowing down his eyes over an ugly green jacket that I wouldn't wear. He won millions of dollars for it too, but there is a fisherman, and I believe his name is Mike Iaconelli. I always get it confused because there is a youth ministry guy named Mike Iaconelli, so I get him kind of confused. But I was watching some videos of him celebrating, and if you've ever seen it, like it is crazy. Just type in Ike something, celebrating fishing. Like this guy catches a fish this long, and he's like, yeah! Like screaming and cussing and throwing it in the water. Like he's like crazy because he's passionate about it. He has a heart for it. And today, what I want to do is I want to tell you that what we at KCC have a heart for. Like what we are going to celebrate, kind of the vision that we have for the church and for the community and how God is going to use us to make changes in people's lives. Because it's not about us, is what we're going to learn, that it's really about Jesus. And the first thing that we're going to celebrate, or that we have a heart for, is that this is a messy place for messy people. Like this will be a messy place for messy people. Like all of us know some messy places, I'm sure. Like how many of you have ever gone into a restaurant and you've seen a cockroach in it? How many of you have gone back? Right, I remember one time I took a trip to Honduras, and I took a whole bunch of people. It was a mission trip. And we did some things in San Pedro Sula, Honduras. And then we went to this very remote island-type village. And it was remote. Like they had to dig a hole in the ground to get water. They had no currency whatsoever. They didn't use money. One group would catch shrimp and trade it with this group over here that was growing banana leaves or something. That was they just traded everything. Had no running water, no sewage, no electricity. It was messy. And on that trip, we took some hairdressers with us, a bunch of them. And I said, man, it would be awesome if when we go to this island, you do all these girls' hairs up. They would love it. They started working on their hair, and they were finding lice this big in their hair. And it was just messy. Like they couldn't stand it. So all of us know messy places. All of us know some messy people too, right? Like, have you ever been holding a baby that's not your own, and it starts to puke on you? Like, what do? You're like, get that thing away from. Take this. Like, because we're afraid of the mess. Like, we don't want to get messy. I was having just dinner Thursday night with a younger couple, and they have about a 2-year-old son. We were sitting at the table talking, and all of a sudden he starts going, and just starts, and I love to see that. Like, I'm kind of weird like that. But I do, like, it cracks me up. But I don't want to get any on me, so I kind of pulled way back, like, just laughing, pointing, like he's 2. But my wife, who's made, like, she just put out there like catcher's mitt. And some of you moms know how to do that. Like, you just catch it. I'm like, that's gross. But messy places and messy people, like, we try to avoid them, really. And that's the same way it is spiritually. Like, we try to avoid the mess spiritually. And spiritually, I think it's just more difficult because we've been taught to pretend in church world that everything's okay. Like, you go to church and pretend it's okay. Like, messy places and messy people, we try to avoid it. And we've been taught for so many years that the church is a good place for good people. That's why people don't come. But here, like, we are a messy place for messy people. But so, Josh, where do you get that? Well, if you look in Luke chapter 19, Luke chapter 19 tells a story about Jesus, and we're going to look at that. And many of you probably know this story. If you've been in church very often, if you went to VBS as a kid even, you've probably heard this story. It's about a guy named Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. And he climbed up in the sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. Like we know the song. We know that. But there are so many things that we can learn from this encounter that Jesus had with Zacchaeus. And it's in Luke chapter 19. We'll start in verse 1. And it says this: Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. Like, Jesus entering Jericho, that was kind of a big deal. Because Jericho was a messy place. When the Israelites, when they were coming out of slavery in Egypt and they'd spent time wandering in the wilderness, they were getting ready to cross over into the promised land. And God said, Jericho's the first city I want you to take. I want you to destroy it. And again, we've got a little song about that. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, 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 and the walls came tumbling down. The whole city was destroyed. It was a messy place. In fact, Joshua, even after that, he put a curse on the city. And he said that cursed is the man that rebuilds this city. If anybody rebuilds this city, he'll be cursed to the point that he loses his firstborn son. Somebody rebuilt the city, firstborn son died. Like, good things didn't happen in Jericho. Good people didn't hang out in Jericho. But here we see Jesus walking into a messy place. You know, Jesus wasn't scared of messy places. And then we see that there was a man there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. Like, I want to pause and say, if you've heard me preach very many times, or maybe online, you've heard me preach. Like, we talk about tax collectors a lot because they're mentioned a lot in the New Testament and the teachings of Jesus. Like, tax collectors were the worst of worst people. Like, they had betrayed their Jewish heritage and went to work for the occupying government of Rome, collecting taxes and ripping off the Jewish people. Like, so they were even worse than sinners. People would often make two categories of people. You had the tax collectors and you had the sinners, and the tax collectors were worse. But Zacchaeus, we read about him, he was a chief tax collector. He is the worst of the worst. Like, if there is a train to hell, like, he's the engineer. Like, he's the guy. Like, Zacchaeus is an evil person. But what we see Jesus is walking into a messy place, and he's getting ready to have an encounter with a messy guy named Zacchaeus, who was the chief tax collector. And I think that's what the church is supposed to be. A messy place for messy people. Philip Yancey wrote a book several years ago called What's So Amazing About Grace. I think it was in the 90s that he wrote it. But he'd interviewed this lady, and she just had this huge list of awful things that she'd done in her life. Like a huge list. And I won't go into all the details about it, but just use your imagination. It was bad. And Philip Yancey asked her, he said, at some point, did you not think of maybe going to church? And her response was this: why would I go to church? I feel guilty enough as it is. I started thinking, like, that's what we've done with church culture in America. Like, we've made it a museum for saints instead of a hospital for sinners. And at the end of the day, this is not a perfect place for perfect people. Like, we are a messy place for messy people. And listen, if you're perfect, you'll probably want to leave because we're going to mess you up. Like, and many think, well, Josh, you say that all the time. I know I do. And I don't think that I could say it enough, because everyone thinks that they want messy people to show up until they actually show up. And by the way, the messy people that are welcomed here, like, they're the people that you looked at in the mirror this morning. Because we're all a mess. None of us have gotten it right. And that's why I have a heart for this place. That's why we'll celebrate in this place, because it's a messy place for messy people. The second thing that we'll celebrate is it's a place where people can see Jesus. Like, it's a place where people can see Jesus. Like, I remember when my kids were little, they're all grown and way too big for this now, but when we would go somewhere and maybe there was a crowd and they couldn't see, like, they would want me to put them up on my shoulders so they could see better. And if you have kids, you know what that's like. Like, and that's a good idea for the first 10 to 15 minutes. But after that, like, your back starts hurting, your shoulders start hurting, your knees start clamping. You're like, you good up there? You ready to come down? Nope. Dang it. Like, but I had to be the one, when my kids were little, I had to be the one that was willing to endure discomfort so that my kids could see what we were trying to see. And I think what the church should do, like, the church should be, like, is a place where we, as Christians, are willing to endure some discomfort so that people can actually see Jesus. Like, we should be able to say, hey, you know what? I may not like that music, or I may not like that carpet, or I may not like that preacher, but you know what? People are seeing Jesus there, and that's good enough for me. I'm willing to endure a little discomfort. I'm willing to step out of the things that I'm used to or accustomed to so that people can see Jesus, because you know what? It's not about me. I just think that's what the church ought to be, a place where people can see Jesus. In verse 3, it says this, that Zacchaeus, that he wanted to see who Jesus was. And I want to stop real quick, and I want you to see this. The Bible doesn't say Zacchaeus wanted to change his life. It doesn't say that he wanted to stop collecting taxes, or he wanted to be a better person, or he wanted to do the right thing even. The Bible doesn't say any of that. All it says is that he wanted to see who Jesus was. He'd heard about this man who had healed lepers by touching them. He'd heard about this man that had brought sight to people who were blind. He'd heard about this guy that had raised the dead to life. He'd heard about this guy. Jesus was famous. Like, if they had Facebook then, he would have millions of followers. But this guy, he just wanted to see who Jesus was. But because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. Like, nobody was going to say, hey, Zach, come on my shoulders. Like, they hated this guy. So he ran ahead and he climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. And Luke does an amazing word thing here, word play here, that by even naming the tree. Like a sycamore fig tree. He could have just said he went and climbed a tree. But Luke's very specific on what kind of tree it was. And because that name, sycamore fig, what it means is defrauder. That's the translation of it. That Zacchaeus, this tax collector, was climbing up and defrauding. And we're going to read that he'd been defrauding people all of his life. But he climbed up there so that he could see Jesus. And this is going to be a place where people can see Jesus. And I want to celebrate that. And that's why we do what we do every week. We have greeters at the door. We have coffee. We have donuts. We have breakfast that we serve every week. This week it's fish. Usually it's biscuits and gravy because fish isn't very good for breakfast. But I'm just saying. But everything that we do, from the service to the music to the sermon, the giving, the communion time, everything we do is so that people can see Jesus. It's not so they can see me or the worship band. It's so that we can see Jesus. And listen, I don't care why they walk in. I don't care if they lost a bet. I don't care if it's just for free fish. The only thing we want is for people to see Jesus. Because listen, theology doesn't change people. Politics doesn't change people. Education doesn't change people. Josh doesn't change people. The only Jesus can change people. And that is what I want people to see every single week. And that's going to be the main focus of this church every single week, is that we lift Jesus higher than anything else. This will be a place, third thing, this will be a place where people can take their next steps. I got a guitar here, and I'm not a very good guitar player, but I can play a little bit. And I started learning the guitar when I was about 17 years old. I had a friend who could play it, and he was pretty good. And I wanted to learn a song. He said, I'll teach you that song. And he said, well, first thing you got to learn is the G chord. I said, okay. And he showed me where to put my fingers. And I put my fingers on there. And I played a G chord. And for weeks, I practiced playing a G chord. And I'd play it once, and I'd take my fingers off, and I'd try to get them back on there in the right place and play a G chord. And I just did that over and over again. So I got to the point where I could just kind of put my fingers on the guitar, and I was playing a G chord. And then he said, well, that's not all you got to learn. He said, next you got to learn a C chord. And I said, okay. So he showed me a C chord. And I practiced getting my fingers on the C chord, and I'd play. So for weeks I would practice just going G, C, G, C. And then I thought it was pretty good because I could do that pretty fast. And then he said, well, there's one more chord you got to learn. That's a D chord. So we're like 6 months in now. I'm a slow learner. I'm honest. So he shows me a D chord, and I finally get it, and I'm playing. So then I could play G, C, D. And the song that I wanted to learn to play, the only reason I learned ever how to play the guitar at all was because there was a song, Are You Washed in the Blood of the Lamb, that I loved. So he taught me how to play that, and it's, have you been to Jesus for the cleansing power? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in His grace this hour? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you washed in the blood, in the soul-cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotless? Are they white as snow? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? So that's why I learned how to play the guitar, for that song. But you know what? None of that takes place unless I spend some time going, it starts there. I want this to be a place where when people do that, we celebrate it. And we don't say, well, that's not very deep. Or you should have stepped a little further than that. Or you should be further along in your walk with Christ than that. Or you shouldn't have done that. I just want to be a place where people take that next step and it gets celebrated. Like, look what happens in the next verse, verse 5. It says, when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up to him and said, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. And I want to stop for a second and just point out the simplicity and the complexity both in this verse. Like, Jesus reached that spot, he looked up to the spot, looking up to Zacchaeus, and he said, Zacchaeus. That, we talked about the sycamore fig tree means defrauder. The word Zacchaeus means not guilty. Like, Jesus stopped right there, looked up in the tree, and said, you're not guilty. And that's the interesting thing about Jesus. Jesus knows our sin, but he calls us by our name. The devil, he knows our name, but he calls us by our sin. So when anybody's throwing your past back up at you and say, hey, you did this, you did this, you did this, you're that, listen, that's not coming from Jesus. Because Jesus will call you by your name. And Jesus will say, hey, you're not guilty. Jesus doesn't stop at that spot and look up and say, hey, tax collector, come down. Or hey, sinner, come down. He called him by his name. And you know what's so amazing about grace is? Zacchaeus hadn't even asked for forgiveness yet. And Jesus said, hey, not guilty, come here. It says, come down at once. You notice it wasn't, hey, Zacchaeus, stop collecting taxes. Zacchaeus, stop sinning. Zacchaeus, you need to start reading your Bible more. Zacchaeus, you need to start giving. Zacchaeus, you need to start fasting. Zacchaeus, you need to be here or be there. Jesus just looked up at the tree and a man who was guilty, and he says, hey, you know what? Just come down. I want to hang out with you. Just come down. And for Zacchaeus, that was G. Now, was that a scary first step for Zacchaeus? Better believe it. Everybody down there hated him. All the other religious people on the planet, they condemned him. They wouldn't even let him in the temple. Now you have the most religious person who's claiming to be the Messiah saying, hey, come down. It's scary. But it was doable. When Jesus asks us to take our next step, listen, it might be scary, but it's doable. He said, Zacchaeus, I want you to come down out of that tree because I'm going to beat you up. I'm going to give you a lecture. Zacchaeus, I'm going to go off on you. No, it was very simple. Like, Zacchaeus, come down because I just want to spend some time with you. No lectures, just love. Let's just sit down and have a meal together. And that right there changed Zacchaeus' life. It says he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. And then what happened is what often happens in Christianity and in church world is that church people got mad. Verse 7, it says, all the people saw this and they began to mutter, he's gone to be a guest of the sinners. Like, they're all mad. Well, he didn't say anything about sin. He didn't tell him he had to stop collecting taxes. I can't believe Jesus would do something like that. Like, Jesus says, hey, come down and spend some time with me. And they all got mad because Jesus wasn't treating the sinner the way that they were. But I'm so thankful that Jesus wasn't scared of guilt by association. And I'm glad because he would have never associated with me if he was. So we're going to celebrate people taking their next steps. Fourth thing is this is a place where people are changed by Jesus. You know, all of us have experienced life-changing events, whether we're married, a graduation, a birth of a child, an accident with a broken bone. Like, we've experienced life-changing events. But I believe there is nothing in the world that has the potential to change people the way Jesus does. Watch what happened to Zacchaeus. All Jesus asked of him was, hey, come down from the tree and hang out with me. We don't know how long they hung out. Could have been hours, could have been days, could have been minutes. We don't know. We don't even know what the conversation was. We don't know what they talked about. But here's what happened. Verse 8, but Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Now, quick question, easy one. Did we read of Jesus saying anything to Zacchaeus about collecting taxes or giving money away? Nope. But after spending time with Jesus, Zacchaeus moves from a taker to a giver. It wasn't Jesus' lecture that changed Zacchaeus, it was his love. People aren't changed through lectures. People aren't changed through Facebook rants. Listen, people are changed by love. And that's why Jesus said, they will know you are my disciples by the way that you love one another. What was Jesus' first request of Zacchaeus? Just come down out of the tree. He went from a taker to a giver. His life was changed because he spent time with Jesus. And that's what I want to see happen here every week. I don't know how long it's going to take for some people. I don't know how long it's going to take for me. But here's what I know. When people come every week and they see Jesus and they take next steps, Jesus will change their lives. It's going to happen. We see people go from lost to found, from blind to sight, from death to life. And listen, I believe we'll see that every single week if we continue to focus on Jesus and celebrate what he celebrates and wants what he wants. We don't change people, Jesus changes people. Which leads to my final point, is that we'll want what Jesus wants. Again, because I don't believe some of you told the truth the first time. How many of you are Cardinals fans? Say, and I'm not going to make fun of you. Cubs fans? Okay. Any hockey fans? I've never understood that game, and that's okay. But sports fans are a weird group of people, you know it? Again, I'm a sports fan, so I'm a weird group of people. But most of you are Cardinals fans above anything else, so I'll use that. But did you know that there are some Cardinals fans that are Republicans? And there are some Cardinals fans that are Democrats? Did you know that? There are Cardinals fans that are vegans. I don't get that at all. I like meat. But there are Cardinals fans that are carnivores. There are Cardinals fans that love country music and Cardinals fans that hate country music. There are Cardinals fans that like rap music. There are Cardinals fans that can dance and that they can't dance. There are blind Cardinals fans and there are Cardinals fans that can see. There are deaf Cardinal fans and Cardinal fans that can hear. Like, they're all different, but you know what? For 3 or 4 hours every time the Cardinals play, like, they put all of those differences aside, and you know what they do? They root for a victory from the Cardinals. And you put it in the playoffs, you get 70,000 people crammed into a stadium, all very different, all putting their differences aside, saying, you know what? We're focused on winning this game. And I just thinking, if we can do that for a sports team, we can set some of our likes and dislikes aside, some of our differences aside, and we can root for a baseball game or a hockey game or a football game. Why in the world can't we do that as a church? Come together despite our differences and simply want what Jesus wants, to seek and save lost people. Watch this. Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. That for the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. And as a church, we're just going to simply want what Jesus wants. And we're going to put our differences aside, even though we may not agree on anything. We're going to agree on that one thing, that this is about pointing people to Jesus because he's the only one that can change people. And his purpose, his mission was to seek and save the lost. And when he found them, he celebrated. And we're going to celebrate what Jesus celebrates here. He wants to see lost people found. He wants to see blind people receive sight. He wants to see dead people come to life. And this morning, I'm just going to be honest with you because I may not get another chance with some of you. If you don't have a relationship with Jesus, listen, the Bible refers to you as lost, blind, or dead. That's what sin does to us. It blinds our eyes so that we can't see. And we're lost and struggling. Ultimately, it kills us spiritually. We're lost, dead, and blind. But I want to tell you today, like Zacchaeus, that Jesus will look to you and he will declare you not guilty. It's a matter of taking that next step, coming down out of that tree where you're at, and accepting him into your life. And we want to give you that opportunity today to go from lost to found, from blind to sight, and from dead to life. I'm going to ask you to stand, and we're going to have a prayer and a time of decision. If there's a decision that you need to make, maybe today you want to make that decision and be immersed in baptism for the forgiveness of sin and the gift of the Holy Spirit. Maybe today you just need to talk to somebody. Todd will be down here. I'll be down here. We'd love to talk with you about what your next step is. We talked about the class that we have starting tomorrow night next. You can register for that online. We're going to talk about what we believe about a whole lot of issues tomorrow night. So we would love to have you join us, but go ahead and register for that. Because we believe when people take their next steps, Jesus changes lives. Father God, we're thankful today for who you are. We're thankful that we have a God who loved us enough to send Jesus to die for us. And that he's not scared of messy places or messy people, because we all fall into that category. Lord, today I thank you that you will declare us not guilty. And it's not based on our merit, it's based on who you are and what you've done. I pray if there's anyone here today that needs to make that next decision, that next step, Lord, I pray you'd give them the boldness and the courage to do it. It's scary, but it's doable. We thank you for Jesus. It's in his name that I pray. Amen.